Years and years ago at one of the World Golf Fitness Summit. My talk was on centration, and so I'm thinking this is around 2013 or 14 maybe. And I do remember there was at least one slide that was showing the Turkish getup. I don't remember if there was anything else that was specific to using kettlebells. But the talk had nothing directly related to kettlebells. And there was Q&A. It was me. It was Al Vermeil, which was very exciting to be a part of. And I don't remember the third person because I think the way that it was set up is that there was three talks that were geared towards a similar type of message. And then there was some Q&A. Well, some goof, and this has happened unfortunately multiple times at the World Golf Fitness Summit, where it's clearly a Q&A, but people don't ask questions. They just say what they want to say. And it's usually some dissent or something that would suggest how much information they know or what they like to do. It's really interesting. Of course, this happens in many other places, but it's happened to me at least twice. And probably not because my message is directly antagonizing of that population. It's pushing them around a little bit. It's very, very keen on biology and physics, which, as many of us know, most people in golf or golf fitness don't really go by the laws of biology and physics. They think they're different in some of these weird ways that are not consistent with science. Anyway, he says, well, you really appear to be a kettlebell guy. He went on to say he was a band guy. I'm like, okay, there was no question. It was quickly redirected. There was nothing that I had to say. No, I'm not. But the reality is, and I use that as a story because I would say, and I don't recall saying it back then, but for all things equal, I would probably choose a kettlebell for all forms of training, just based on what you can do. Keep in mind two things, and I need to say this more, is it kind of struck me several months ago, especially when I connect with and look at a lot of what coaches do at the college level, where barring the way you see in the portal for certain sports, you have athletes for a very, very long period of time, and you can angle a 4-year plan, a 3-year plan to do that. And I don't have that. That's not a big part of the people that I work with. My perspective on what I like to do and what I think is effective is always going to be biased through the lenses of working with people that are severely, severely injured and the highest level of professional athletes. It's interesting for different reasons, but limit opportunities of growth, meaning limit strength, limit power, the top end stuff. Over here, they don't have the joints to be able to get into those positions to absorb and adapt to stress. And then over here, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. Whereas it's always exciting to see, and there was just a talk from the basketball coach of Mississippi State, I think it was Mississippi State, and I was just so impressed, not only because he weaved a story into his talk, but it showed his bias, which I thought was not even his intent, and I think that's really useful. Getting back to kettlebells, my bias is that kettlebells would be the choice, including for space if you're on an island and you need this. But let's talk a little bit about what drives that biology and physics, and particularly physics, is the offset center of gravity of the kettlebell. Now, if you're actually holding the kettlebell at your side, and we've run lots of Instagram posts over the last several weeks or months in terms of deadlift and farmer's walk, where this distraction component is making a very, very effective case for training the rotator cuff in non-provocative static stability. Well, you can get your hand and center the kettlebell, and it just kind of feels like it drags you down. Where, at least for my itty bitty little hands, and the size of your hands is going to come into play for the different positions of the kettlebell, holding a dumbbell, it kind of like rocks. It's very, very difficult to always, for every single person, for every single dumbbell, find that center. And everyone's unique grip. I have this, it's not a Dupuytren's, but it looks like a Dupuytren's, but that's a bony change. That's not a soft tissue contracture. So it's difficult for me to hook under and create force. Lots of reasons for that. So again, I'm always going by my bias, but you can take anybody who has smaller hands for a larger bell, and the bell will teeter ever so slightly, which then, if you're walking, is then compounded. So that's something that's very, very interesting. But maybe if there's one other, I don't know what it's called, if it has a name, but when you hold the bell, not on the handle, not on the horns, in this open hand position, in this front squat position, I think if you have a big enough hand and a small enough bell, it can sit there and you can just go to work. But if your hand is on the opposite side, meaning it's smaller than what is larger, there's no way you're ever going to actually centrate the kettlebell on the palm of your hand. And there's this extra stabilization demand. So when you're holding it on your side, it's less. But when you're up here, while it's possible, it's I don't even know that people really use that position that much. When I say circus kettlebell, that's not to be degrading. That's actually a thing where all sorts of juggling and some very impressive athletic dance-like maneuvers with a very, very heavy kettlebell. So maybe you'll see that with some circus expositions. But again, those dudes or young ladies. There's a young lady I follow on Instagram, and she does lots of juggling with the kettlebell. Now it's a very little, it's a competition kettlebell, so you can't tell that it's really, really light. But when you're seeing it do triple flips before she catches it, it's really, really impressive. So, but in most of the other positions, if not all, whether it's in the rack position, bottoms up, the goblet is centrated. But when you have the bell, instead of comparing the dumbbell on my left, which sits this way and just wants to push me straight down, if anything, if I'm not centered on the handle of the dumbbell, it brings me this way or this way. The kettlebell, which I typically can get centered, and I feel like it kind of pulls me down, it also wants to pull me this way or that way, no matter how I'm carrying it. Dumbbell, I can really lock it up. If it's light, I can hold it in the middle. Kettlebell, it doesn't matter. And that to me is huge value. And that's where the value came from that golf talk years ago in terms of centration, that when there is this reactive physics, meaning the bell doesn't want to just go this way, it wants to go that way, which is a vector of that way, you then have to do something at the shoulder to be able to stabilize. One of the interesting little baby tests you can do, I'm sure you know how much you can deadlift with a bar. I'm sure you know how much you can deadlift with a trap bar. They're probably different because there's different physics. How about you set up the exact same height and set up two kettlebells in that double suitcase in that farmer's position, the same way that the trap bar is set up, and then try and deadlift. And just try to set up the handles the exact same place. I think you'll find that the double kettlebell position, the same exact weight as the trap bar, same height, everything's equal, is going to be significantly more difficult. And that's because your shoulders are on an island. And that shoulders being on an island, figuratively rolling around, is a significant demand that requires stabilization of the shoulder. And then stabilization of the shoulder is going to be impacted by your thoracic, by your rib, and by your pelvis position. So all of those things are emphasized, whereas with the trap bar, because it's all connected, and you can get away with some other types of strategies that allow you to put more weight on the bar. So if there is an adaptation and development that is only related to more wheels on the bar, you win. That's a better choice. But I don't know that that's necessary for my bias of people in rehab and high-level sports. And again, I need to say that more when I talk about the things that are important to me. When you're in the rack position, again, as I mentioned earlier, the bell wants to run on you, okay? And it doesn't matter whether you're holding two or you're holding just one, the offset center of mass of the bell is always going to be either your friend to accomplish something that other models can't accomplish, or your enemy because the bell will run on you when it gets really, really heavy. So certainly when you're in a get-up position and you've got the bell in the rack and it's now overhead, again, high value for lots of other things that just make sense. You can press a barbell. You can't divide it typically into two dumbbells, and you certainly can't divide it into two kettlebells. Now, why is that? Well, again, the barbell is connected. So you have this inherent closed system that covers up for different strategies of mobility and stability and skill. Okay, that I think we get. But now, what's the difference between that kettlebell and the dumbbell? Well, again, if you can press, just make it even, 200 pounds, which is a very respectable military press. I don't think 100 people out of 100 can press 200-pound dumbbells. I'm not sure they're getting 100-pound dumbbells up in the rack. But let's say it's on old story from, we didn't know we were there, but we were at the Atlantis headquarters in suburban Montreal. And they have all these amazing pieces of equipment that no one has ever seen before because it was their warehouse, it was their lab, but it was open as a public gym. Anyway, there are systems that you can put in place where the dumbbells unrack the same way as a barbell. I still don't think that person's taking 200s and popping them overhead. If they are, their max of a military press is way, way bigger than two wheels, okay? Now, there's even less of those individuals that are gonna take 206-pound kettlebells and press them overhead. The technique is completely different. If I turn to the side a little bit, I can kind of be in this, even if I'm restricted in my shoulder, but if I kind of take this sort of overhead position, the dumbbell still wants to go straight down. I can move my wrist. I take a big kettlebell, try to move your wrist, it's not going to happen. The thing will run on you. It's going to be uncomfortable. It has to be very, very, very light. But now, when you're in that, kind of landmine-ish incline position, you're going to have to crack the wrist to get the bell, because the bell is going to be way, way out in front. So when you're pressing with this pronated grip, whether that's correct or not is probably up for discussion. But now the bell wants to run on you this way, and it's not going to be able to be carriage. And I think that's an advantage. That's an advantage, because now there's another concept, less about centration and demanding certain things of the shoulder. We kind of check those boxes, but more so lowest system load. And that is a concept that I think is crucial, where you're going to try to get as much out of your effort as possible. And a lot of that, again, stemming to the laws of biology and physics, is about force. And here's the test I'd like you to do. I'd like you to take 80%, whatever your trap bar deadlift is. Let's go back to that setup, and where you now know that you cannot double suitcase kettlebell deadlift the same amount as the trap bar. I think for most people watching this, you'll find that to be true. If you do have access to a force plate, see how much force you're putting into the mat. And that's an interesting factor, because I think they're going to be closer than you think. And there are other movements of a kettlebell, such as the kettlebell swing, where you can generate upwards of 4 times your body weight into the force plate, but be using, for a 200-pound man, a 24-kilo kettlebell. How does that even happen? Some of the early teachings from, what will soon be 20 years ago, Pavel would talk about the WTH effect. What the hell? Like, how does this even happen? A lot of those things were also for using relatively light weight. How did that affect max limit loads? The WTH effect was how you would have this very seeming cardiovascular effect, but then not be really trying to challenge those types of systems. You thought you were just challenging strength. So there's a lot of things, and we can make some other videos talking about more of the kettlebell swing. That's not a big piece here, but again, I don't think you can accomplish all of the same things doing a dumbbell swing, which I've seen people try and do. And even if it looks smooth in the hinge, it just doesn't look right, because you don't have that pop, you don't have that aggression at the top of the swing, because you certainly don't want the bell to be running up on you and down, but you can have a little bit of give there, where if you're holding the dumbbell, there's no give at all. So it's very difficult to snap and pop. Hey, there's another reason I would pick kettlebell. I would pick a dumbbell before nothing. I'd pick a barbell before nothing. But I think some of the things related specifically to the shoulder, but it doesn't have to be about the shoulder. I think it's about physics. It's about having that off-center center of mass, and then how you are compelled to carriage the bell for your walks, double walks. You can do double walks with a sled behind you. You can do marches. But then certainly when you press overhead, that's where there's a huge, huge recognizable difference. Because again, the bell wants to go behind you, wants to run down back behind you, rather than a dumbbell that wants to run straight down. If you have everything, I think there's opportunities for everything. I think you're going to give away a lot of potential hypertrophy, because lowest system load probably leaves that on the table. It doesn't necessarily, my opinion is that it doesn't leave strength on the table. But ultimately, what I would love to be able to see one day and test is there any truth to how much force you're putting into the ground, and how fast you put that force into the ground versus how fast you're not putting into the ground. That'll probably decide the adaptation. But if I can accomplish something with less overall load on top of my system, on top of my body, that might be something that's very, very desirable, and that shouldn't be very, very hard to test. I don't know the answer. I know that there's some things out there. I just know that for me, N of 1, there's a lot of lifts. They typically involve kettlebell that feel much, much harder to do for much less weight than a barbell. So I wonder if that difficult carriage of the bell translates into how much force you're putting into the ground. At that point, it could be a very, very compelling argument. I think it'd be cool if a researcher wanted to look at those things, or if they need more information, you know where to find me.